For the past few years, Doctor Who had been slowly dragging itself out of the mud, going from a show that was viewed by those within the BBC itself as an embarrassing relic, to one that, despite still having flaws, was much more respectable and gathered a healthy audience of fans. But as 1995 was underway, big changes for the show were about to commence, as the show was about to undergo one of its biggest behind the scenes shuffles in its long history. Season 32 of Doctor Who would have starred Richard Griffiths as the 8th Doctor, along with Lisa Bauman as Bernice Summerfield and Robert Bathurst as Chris Hector. It would also see Stephen Garwood acting as producer, with Colin Brake as script editor. Season 32 marked both new beginnings and final ends. Between seasons, several radical changes had taken place, which would seriously change how the show was produced. Firstly, this was the first season for new producer Stephen Garwood. Much like his script editor, Garwood wished to try and take Doctor Who further into the 1990s, whilst trying to make the show a worthy opponent to shows like Star Trek The Next Generation and its recently launched sister series, Voyager. This would also be Griffiths' 5th and final year as the 8th Doctor. Feeling that 5 years was enough, along with the actor's fear of being typecast, Griffiths announced that he would be departing at the end of the season in order to give way for a new Doctor. However, a much more radical change had taken place between seasons. Since the early 1990s, the government had been encouraging the BBC to have their shows be produced by independent companies, with more and more shows heading in that direction. Since 1992, the BBC had been looking for the right company to produce Doctor Who for them, but all of them were either uninterested, unavailable, or unsuitable. By the end of 1993, however, and with the slight resurgence in Doctor Who's popularity, more companies began to show their interest in the franchise. By 1994, a deal was struck with the production company Carnival Films. Although they weren't initially interested in the property, as they were put off by the idea of doing a sci-fi show, by the time of the show's resurgence in popularity, they were willing to take the risk, and so from season 32 onwards, Carnival Films would produce Doctor Who for the BBC. With Carnival now running the show, numerous changes were implemented. Brian Eastman, the founder of Carnival, would join on as an executive producer. Although he wouldn't be heavily involved in the production, he would keep an eye on the show and would make suggestions to the production team where he felt it was needed. However, the biggest change would come in the format change. As another means of trying to compete with glossy American imports, the show's format was radically changed to something similar to that of season 22. The episode runtime was increased from 25 minutes to 45, with stories now consisting of 2 or even just 1 part. With this longer runtime, the episode count was decreased from 20 to 12 to make up, resulting in 2 single-parters and 5 two-parters. Season 32 would air between the 8th of July 1995 and the 23rd of September 1995. It would consist of 12 episodes across 7 stories, with 2 single-parters and 5 two-parters, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. This story begins with the TARDIS being pursued by a ship belonging to a race of cyborgs known as the Knights of Tarjan, after the Doctor stole one of their deadly weapons known as an anti-heart. We see the Doctor flailing around the control room, frantically operating the controls as the Knights fire lasers at the TARDIS. The Doctor attempts to dematerialise into the time vortex and pulls the main flight lever down. However, just as the TARDIS begins to take off, the Knights fire a weapon of mass destruction at the TARDIS just as it begins to fade away. This results in both the generation of a strange cloud of energy, which pulls both the TARDIS and Tarjan ship through. After a flash of light, we see the Tarjan ship alone in space. We cut to the bridge of the ship, where the Knight Captain tracks the TARDIS to Earth. We then cut to what appears to be 1920s America, where we see the TARDIS phasing in and out as it struggles to land. The Doctor hoists the lever back up, resulting in the console overloading and the TARDIS shutting down. The trio exit the TARDIS, finding themselves in what appears to be 1920s America. However, after picking up a newspaper, Chris discovers that the year is actually 1954. The Doctor manages to reboot the TARDIS's power and discovers that the result of the explosion and the TARDIS dematerialising at the same time has resulted in both the TARDIS and the Tarjan army being sent sideways into a parallel universe, one where technological advancement seems much slower. He also discovers that the Tarjan Knights are on their way to Earth, and that they have roughly 48 hours to either send the Knights back to their correct universe, or, if it comes down to the worst, prepare the planet to fight back. The story would then see the Doctor, Bernice and Chris having to convince the leaders of the world about the oncoming invasion and prepare the planet for a potential war. Initially, the leaders refuse to listen to the trio and have them arrested after seeing their advanced technology. It turns out that the government of the world have been deliberately banning any technology beyond the year 1925 in fears that it could be turned into a weapon. When they initially see the trio possessing technology which is way beyond the 1950s, they're deemed to be terrorists and to be executed. However, the Doctor is eventually able to convince them they're strangers from a parallel universe when he gets them to examine the TARDIS. The story then sees the governments of the world uniting to prepare the planet for the Tarjan attack. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Bernice successfully restore the TARDIS's power and attempt to find a way to stop the Tarjans from wiping out the Earth. The Doctor theorises that by connecting the anti-heart to the TARDIS, he could create an EMP which could completely shut down the Knights forever. However, unless it was carefully programmed to only knock out Tarjan technology, which he doesn't have time to do, the anti-heart will also wipe out human technology, sending the planet back into the Stone Age. The Doctor begins to reprogram the anti-heart, but runs out of time. The Knights' battleship arrives on Earth and full war kicks out between the humans and the Knights. The Doctor tries his best to finish reprogramming the anti-heart, but soon realises that by the time he finishes the job, most, if not all, of the human population would be slaughtered. So, realising that he has no other choice, he activates the anti-heart. We then see every Knight across the planet suddenly stop and collapse to the floor, as well as all machinery and lights going out across Earth. The story would then end with the Doctor apologising to the leaders of the world, before suggesting that they could maybe rebuild their world using the remains of the Tarjan technology. We then end with the Doctor, Bernice and Chris returning to the TARDIS, where the Doctor successfully pilots the TARDIS back to their universe. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris investigating the New World University, an institution of higher education run by a posh rich woman named Rebecca Campbell. We see the Doctor and his companions discovering that the NWU has no instructors or tutors, as all instructions come from computers. They also find the students, known as Chilies, to appear almost empty and hypnotised. It turns out that the NWU is actually being controlled by the Great Intelligence. We discover that the Intelligence, who has possessed the corpse of Professor Travers, manipulated Rebecca, who we learn to be his niece, to take her family fortune and establish the NWU. The Intelligence is using the university's computer systems in order to control the Chilies. It then plans to spread throughout the internet and create a worldwide web of fear. Eventually, however, the Intelligence is defeated when the Doctor, Bernice and Chris are able to destroy the NWU's generators, which destroys most of the Intelligence, as well as finally putting Travers to rest. The story then ends with the trio saying goodbye to Rebecca, who announces that she plans to shut down the NWU for good. The trio then leave in the TARDIS just as units begins to arrive on the scene. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris arriving on Ragi, a moon in the Unuculi system, where they find that the population of the lower class system are struck down by a strange new disease. Furthermore, they discover that several scientists are vanishing without a trace. It turns out that the Sontarans are responsible for both problems. It turns out that the disease was created by the Sontarans to make all people infected with it to register as Sontarans on routine scanning devices, which would prompt the routines to avoid that area of space, and would give Sontarans unrestricted access to the Unuculi system. However, the Doctor is able to stop the Sontarans by contacting Routine Command and warning them about the Sontarans. Speaking with the Routines, the Doctor is able to come to an agreement with them, offering to trade the strategic data he downloaded from the Sontarans' computer net in exchange for the Routines' promise to leave the human colonists alone. The Routines agree and, knowing the Sontarans' plan, are able to push the Sontarans off-world. This story sees the TARDIS arriving on the Rock of Judgment, an asteroid prison used by the natives of the Uva Beta Uva system. There the team encounter a police officer named Frank Spigot, who initially claims to be looking into anomalies in the computer system. However, they soon discover that he is really looking into the murders of a mining team on Planet 11. He says that the environmental engineer had been psychologically crushed to death, and that the only person he knows who kills in that manner was Zay, a dangerous psychic mutated human. However, it was reported that Zay had been executed on a rock 3 years prior, and so Spigot is trying to find out if she might be alive still. It turns out that, although she had been executed, Zay's consciousness lived on through a death mask. We learn that just before her execution, an artist made a mask out of her face out of helicon, and she was able to imprint her mind into the mask, allowing it to survive. With this mask, it allows Zay to possess those who wear it, with Zay planning to kill hundreds of people, which she refers to as normals, to avenge her fellow mutants who were killed by the normals. We see Zay take control of the Rock's chief of security named Margot, where she proceeds to sabotage the Rock's computer system to deactivate the defences, allowing her criminal allies on board. We'd also discovered that a high Akron on the Rock named Pyrepoint is actually the head of a large criminal empire and plans to use Zay to set himself up as ruler of the system. Partway through the story, when Margot is killed, Pyrepoint forces Zay's mask onto Bernice, allowing her to be possessed. However, the Doctor is eventually able to help free her from the mask. Zay convinces Pyrepoint to put on the mask so that she can give him her secret of immortality. However, while struggling for control, he is killed by one of the station's robots, which Pyrepoint had ironically programmed earlier to kill any intruders. Then, deprived of a body, Zay would be defeated when the Doctor and Frank create a formula that renders Zay's mask inert, eliminating any remnant of her mind from it. This story would have been set primarily in 1980s London, where we see the Doctor investigating a new drug named Smile, which is being sold by a dealer known as the Kappa, who apparently died many years ago. It turns out that a Gallifrey machine named N-Form has bonded with the Kappa's corpse and took on his identity. We'd find that the N-Form was created for the war against the great vampires and is looking for vampiric waveform, which it discovers in a boy named Gabriel Tyler and his long-lost twin brother that his mother gave away in 1977. The mother, Winnie, sold one of her children, named Stephen, to the Jericho family as money was low. However, Gabriel had a low-level glamour, which made people view him however they wished, as well as being mildly telepathic. We find that the twins were psychically linked and their separation damaged the connection, which caused Gabriel to unknowingly drain energy from Stephen. After 10 years, Eva Jericho brought the sickly Stephen to Winnie, asking her to exchange the quote-unquote damaged goods for a healthy son. The proximity of his twin caused Gabriel to drain the remaining energy from Stephen, which killed him and resulted in the activation of the N-Form. The N-Form eventually merges with Stephen's mother, Eva, and Gabriel goes out on a killing spree. However, the Doctor is able to deactivate N-Form by causing Eva's death, which leaves Gabriel in a vegetative state. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris being summoned to Little Cadwell by Bernice's father, Isaac, who explains that he needs their help in his investigation into a tech company named Purasuch. He explains that the company has gone from being practically non-existent to being one of the biggest companies in the world within a matter of months, thanks to their cheap but highly advanced plastic mobile phones. He also explains that there have been reports of random people who'd recently purchased one of their phones, mysteriously vanishing without a trace. The story would see the Doctor, Bernice and Chris working alongside Isaac in the pyramid to investigate and possibly uncover a potential alien invasion which is operating under the disguise of Purasuch. The Doctor eventually discovers that the CEO of Purasuch, Jill Kramer, is actually under the control of the Nestene consciousness. We find that the Nestene has been forcing Jill and Purasuch to produce these mobile phones as they act as transmitters, which will bring the Nestene down to Earth. The phones being sold at a cheap price in order to increase the amount of active transmitters. When Jill realises that the Doctor is onto them, the Nestene forces Jill to begin the invasion. We see every pure as such phone across the planet screeching out an ear-piercing sound as it pulls the Nestene closer and closer to Earth. We also see hundreds of shop window dummies coming to life with a full-blown Auton assault commencing. Eventually, however, the Doctor, with help from Isaac and Bernice, is able to stop the Nestene's arrival by intersecting the transmission signal and replacing it with a wave that'll instead expel the Nestene from Earth. The signal also makes all Autons harmless and destroys all of the pure as such phones. This story begins with the Doctor, Bernice and Chris arriving in what they initially believed to be 1990s London in the middle of the night. However, after a few minutes, the trio are surrounded by Nazi officers and arrested for breaking curfew. As they're being taken to a prison, they start to see Nazi symbolism scattered across the city, leading them to realise that the unthinkable has happened. Somehow, someone or something has changed the timeline, and Nazi Germany has won the Second World War. In jail, the Doctor, Bernice and Chris begin theorising exactly how and when history changed in order to create this timeline. Chris wonders whether any of their previous adventures had anything to do with it, but the Doctor believes that whoever or whatever has caused this has nothing to do with them. Theorising that the TARDIS might be able to help them, the trio proceed to break out of jail, subdue the guards, and make a sprint back to the TARDIS. However, before the trio can escape, the Doctor is grabbed and held at gunpoint by a Nazi high commanding officer who orders Bernice and Chris to surrender. The two are forced to comply and then arrested again, with the commanding officer telling them that the Führer wishes to meet them. Confused as to how the Führer knows who the Doctor is, but suspecting he'll learn when he meets him, the Doctor allows himself to be dragged away. The group are taken to a giant government building where they're taken to stand before the Führer, and to the Doctor's horror, the Führer is none other than the Master. The Master orders his men to leave as he wishes to speak to the Doctor in private. The Doctor, filled with boiling rage, confronts the Master, asking him what the hell he thinks he's doing. The Master then reveals his motives behind changing the timelines, seeing that he believes with the right guide and the right man in charge, the Nazis have the potential to become one of the greatest warrior races in history, comparing them to the likes of the Daleks and Sontarans. He then reveals to the Doctor exactly how he changed the timeline. He reveals that in the original timeline, the Nazis created a deadly weapon which was lost and completely destroyed towards the end of the war. Fortunately for the Master, he knew all about this deadly weapon, and so went back in time to find it and return it to the Nazis. From there, he helped the Nazis fight back and eventually win World War II, as well as slowly climbing up the ranks into the position of the new Führer. The Doctor asks what exactly this deadly weapon was, to which the Master says he's about to find out, as he signals his guards to take the Doctor and his companions to the cage. The trio are then tossed into a stone chamber and the doors are sealed shut behind them. A few moments later, the sounds of old pipes echo through the chamber, followed by the faint sound of gas escaping from somewhere. The trio then notice a strange green chemical slowly seeping into the room through a ventilation shaft. A nerve gas. The Doctor sniffs the air and tells Bernice and Chris to keep well back, saying that if this is what he thinks it is, they'll all be dead if they even inhale a molecule of it. As the group backs into a corner, the Doctor rummages for his pocket and pulls out a box of matches. He proceeds to strike a match and throw it into the gas, causing it to ignite and burn out. Seeing the Doctor's survival on the CCTV camera, the Master barks at his men to shoot them dead. Two armed guards enter the chamber, but are knocked unconscious by Bernice and Chris. As they snatch their rifles off their bodies, the alarms are raised. The trio sprint through the prison and break out through a back door. As they sprint back to the TARDIS, we see what looks like the entire army chasing after them. Arriving at the TARDIS, 3 Nazi officers are waiting for them, however Bernice and Chris gun them down. They then make their way into the TARDIS and take off. Once in flight, the Doctor uses the TARDIS's databanks to identify the nerve gas, as well as locating where and when the Master acquired it. He identifies the gas as Gastrin 7, just as the Doctor suspected, one of the most dangerous experimental weapons conducted by the Nazis during World War II. From there, he's successfully able to track down its source of origin, which is on board a Nazi cargo ship which was last located in the South Pole in July of 1945. Landing in the South Pole, the trio are greeted by the sight of the Nazi cargo ship, trapped within the ice, but slowly sinking. As they approach the ship, they're suddenly surrounded and held at gunpoint by a group of Russian soldiers who question the trio about their presence. The Doctor manages to convince them that they're secret agents on behalf of His Majesty's Secret Service, before asking the Russians what they're doing here. The captain, Captain Mikhailov, explains that they've received intel from a Nazi POW that the cargo ship contains a deadly nerve gas and the Russians are here to destroy it, believing that no army on Earth, not even Mother Russia, should possess such a deadly weapon. However, he also explains that they need to be quick with their mission, as the POW also revealed that a group of Nazis, led by an unknown ally, are also in the area and are hoping to reclaim the nerve gas. Agreeing to work with the Russians, with the Doctor choosing to believe Mikhailov, the trio join the Russians on their expedition through the vessel. The group enters the bowels of the cargo ship and proceed to make their way towards the heart of it, where the gastron is being stored. As they venture deeper, they come across numerous corpses of Nazi officers, their faces smothered in cuts, rashes and exposed pockets of skin, presumably the victims of some kind of accident involving a leak. The crew also navigate through several obstacles and blockages, pushing through the rubble of the collapsing ship, and carefully balancing across a part of the ship that is close to collapsing. Eventually the group makes it to the heart of the ship. They enter a large laboratory containing several testing chambers and huge tanks of Gastron 7. The Doctor looks around the room in disgust, taking in the sights of the worst of humanity, stating that they need to destroy this ship once and for all. However, before anyone can act, Mikhailov announces in a clear and all too familiar English voice that he'll be taking over from now. Hearing this voice, the Doctor turns around as Mikhailov begins to peel the fake skin off his face. The Master. 3 of the Russian soldiers hold the Master at gunpoint, before their guns are shot out of their hands by the other 3 Russians, revealing themselves to be working for the Master. And as the Doctor's party attempts to back out of the room, the doorway is blocked by 2 Nazi officers, also working with the Master. The Master reveals to the Doctor that he is the same version of the Master he met in 1995. Knowing that the Doctor would likely try and stop him, the Master followed him back to 1945 and sent a telepathic message to his younger self, telling him to wait for 2 more hours before retrieving the Gastron, giving the older Master time to dispose of the Doctor and keep the timeline intact. The Doctor tells the Master that he won't get away with this. The Master chuckles and tells him that he already has, he's already won, before ordering his men to grab the Doctor's group and lock them away, saying that they might as well test the Gastron while they're here. The trio and one of the Russians, Private Kuzmin, are locked in a chamber, whilst the remaining 2 Russians are thrown into an opposite chamber. A Nazi operates a control panel, and the sounds of pipes creaking and gas travelling begins to echo through the room. The Gastron begins to pump into the cell containing the 2 Russians. As the gas enters the room, their lungs breathe in the deadly agent. Their skin begins to crack, boil, burn, melt, almost every imaginable horrifying way to die. The chamber echoes with blood-crawling screams, before their now lifeless bodies slowly drift to the ground. Bernice, Chris and Kuzmin stare into the other room, with horror and stress written on their faces. The Master looks into the Doctor's chamber and wishes him farewell, before pulling down the second switch. And a few seconds later, nothing. The control panel alerts the Master of a fault deeper within the ship, which is blocking the Gastron from entering the Doctor's chamber. The Master takes his Nazi soldiers with him to locate the fault, whilst he orders the Russians to check for any more faults in the control panel, giving the Doctor and his group a small window of time to save their skin. The Doctor quickly turns to Kuzmin and orders him to radio into High Command to tell them to sink the ship. Kuzmin explains that they'll all die this way, but the Doctor tells him to just do it, with a hint of anger under his breath. Kuzmin fumbles with his radio and tells High Command to destroy the ship, citing it as a code black, no survivors. A few seconds later, the whole ship begins to rumble. Suddenly the entire room is hit with a mighty force, which blows the doors off the chambers. Bernice, Chris and Kuzmin dash out of the chamber and knock the 3 Russians out cold. The Doctor then orders Bernice and Chris to get back to the TARDIS. The 2 protest at this order before the Doctor yells at them to do as they are told. The 2 reluctantly agree before they dash away back to the TARDIS. The Doctor meanwhile tells Kuzmin to follow him, saying that they've got to stop the Master no matter what. The 2 dash down several corridors until they find the Master and his men. The Master's men and Kuzmin are caught in the gunfight, which Kuzmin wins. He then holds the Master at gunpoint, with the Doctor telling the Master that it's over. The Master then laughs, saying that it's far from being over just yet, before swiping out a sidearm from under his coat and gunning down Kuzmin with a single bullet. The Doctor then throws the Master to the ground, causing him to accidentally fire his gun at a pipe in the wall. The pipe begins to rapidly shoot out a green gas. Gastrin 7. Meanwhile, Bernice and Chris, who are still making their way out of the ship, hear the gunfire, followed by the sound of gas escaping, and dash back into the ship, fearing the absolute worst. They turn a few corners and find the Doctor, his face covered in burn marks and blisters, slowly crawling across the ground. They look around, but there's no sign of the Master. Chris turns the Doctor over to examine him. His heart is slowly stopping, his coughing gets more and more drier, and his voice is turned to gravel. Bernice and Chris sling the Doctor's arms over their shoulders and begin to carry him out of the ship. However, unbeknownst to the trio, we see the Master, covered in very few blemishes from the gastron, but close to the brink of death. We see him watch the Doctor being carried away, before turning down a corridor, and then we hear the familiar sound of a TARDIS taking off. We then see the trio emerging from the ship, with Bernice and Chris still carrying the Doctor. They steadily approach the TARDIS as we see one final missile strike down on the side of the ship, causing it to explode and finally sink under the ice. As they approach the TARDIS, the Doctor uses his remaining strength to stand on his own. He retrieves the key from his pocket and unlocks the doors, as Bernice and Chris help him inside as he begins to lose his balance. On board, Bernice sets the TARDIS into flight, whilst Chris helps the Doctor into his chair, where he momentarily passes out. The Doctor is dying, and there's nothing they can do. He lets out a few violent coughs as he slowly begins to reopen his eyes. Bernice dashes over to his side in panic and asks the Doctor to tell her what she can do to save him. The Doctor sighs and says he's afraid there's nothing she can do. This old body has had it. Bernice asks the Doctor if it's time, and the Doctor nods. Tears begin to form in Bernice's eyes as she puts her head into his knee. Chris is a little taken aback by this remark, "it's time," and asks if this means what he thinks it means. Bernice lifts her head, wiping a tear from her eye, before saying it does. Regeneration. The death of one Doctor and the birth of another. The Doctor tells Bernice and Chris to be tough, be strong, and to look after the new one. He sighs and says, "It's like I always say, nothing lasts forever. Not even life. Take care, you two." As the Doctor closes his eyes and braces himself, a burst of bright light forms around the Doctor. Bernice and Chris watch as the old man that changed their lives is engulfed by bright light. Under the light they can see the skin smoothing, the great beard retracting, and the hair darkening as their Doctor is replaced with a completely different man. The light snaps away and Bernice and Chris are left staring at the new Doctor, played by Hugh Bonneville. As if suddenly waking up from a nap, the new Doctor snaps to life. Taking a few moments to adjust, he realises he no longer needs his glasses and takes them off. He looks at his companions and says, "That went about as smoothly as one can hope for." Season 32 would have been regarded as an interesting, though slightly divisive season. At the time, many felt unsure on whether the 45-minute format was working. It would later be discovered that these stories for this season started out in life as traditional 3- and 4-parters, but were fused and shortened for the new format. Nevertheless, most people agreed that Carnival were a solid pick to run Doctor Who, and felt that the 8th Doctor was given a good final season. Overall, Griffiths' tenure as the Doctor would go down as one of the best, as well as one of the most important. It's thanks to Griffiths and the likes of Ian Fraser, Ben Aronovich, Colin Brake and Stephen Garwood that the show was able to survive into the 1990s, going from crawling on its knees to once again standing strong. And so the 8th Doctor's tenure came to a close, and a new, younger actor was waiting in the wings for his tenure to begin. Following on from Griffiths would be a tough act and would be a daunting task for any actor. Would Bonneville be the man to do it?